Think about this for a second. Ask the average person on the street to name their country's finance minister, and most of them will go completely blank. Or ask them who runs the central bank, or the name of their local congressman. There would most likely be silence. But say the name Pablo Escobar, and watch what happens. It doesn't matter if you're in Tokyo, Toronto, Lagos, or London. It doesn't matter if you're 18 or 80. Everyone knows that name. Everyone has a feeling attached to it. And that right there is where the story of the most powerful criminal who ever lived begins. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on December 1st, 1949 in the small town of Rio Negro, Colombia. He was the third of 7 children born to a farmer and a school teacher. There's nothing in that origin story that would signal what was coming. He had no inherited empire, no criminal dynasty, no powerful family connections. Just a poor boy from a poor family in a country that, at the time, had very little use for either of them. He grew up in Medellin, a city that in the 1950s and 60s was rapidly urbanizing and deeply unequal. The wealth gap was staggering, and for a young boy watching the rich move through the city like they owned it, because they did, something hardened inside Pablo Escobar. A chip formed on his shoulder that he would carry for the rest of his life, one that he'd use to fuel one of the most extraordinary rises in modern history. By the time he died at age 44, Forbes magazine had listed him on their international billionaires list for 7 consecutive years, from 1987 to 1993. In 1989, they ranked him the 7th richest person on the entire planet, and that was built from nothing, absolutely nothing. A farmer's son from the hills of Antioquia who, through a combination of brilliance, brutality, and sheer audacity, became the most powerful private individual on earth. This is a story that gets more unbelievable the closer you look at it. Here's something that people often skip past when they tell the Escobar story. Before he was a billionaire, before he was the most feared man in the Western Hemisphere, Pablo Escobar was a small-time thief with a talent for fighting angles nobody else saw. His earliest known crimes were frankly almost funny. He stole tombstones from local graveyards, had them resanded and refinished, and then resold them to grieving families. He sold fake diplomas and smuggled contraband and stereo equipment. His first formal arrest came in 1974 for car theft. He was 24 years old, but the theft charges and the petty smuggling were just the prelude. By the early 1970s, Escobar had started drifting into the cocaine trade, first as a low-level runner, then as a small-time dealer, learning the supply chains and the power structures from the bottom up. He was watching, absorbing, and most importantly, he was thinking about scale in a way that nobody else around him was. In 1976, a moment arrived that crystallized exactly who Pablo Escobar was. He and his cousin, Gustavio Gaviria, were arrested while transporting 20 kilograms of cocaine that had been hidden inside spare tires. The arresting officers thought they had caught a small-time smuggler. Well, what they had actually done was make one of the costliest decisions of their lives. The charges against Escobar were eventually dropped, and the arresting officers were killed. That was Escobar's answer to the legal system, and it was one he would repeat over and over again for the next 17 years. By some accounts, Escobar had made his first $1 million by the time he was 22 years old, and by the late 1970s, he had partnered with the Ochoa brothers and several other major players to form what would become the most powerful drug trafficking organization the world has ever known, the Medellin Cartel. From tombstones to cocaine to a criminal empire, the rise was so fast that by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. But there's a problem with telling the financial story of Pablo Escobar, and the problem is this: the numbers are so large that the human brain genuinely cannot process them. You could hear a figure, nod along, and move on without ever truly grasping what it means. So let's try to make it real. At the peak of the Medellin Cartel's operation, they controlled an estimated 80% of the world's entire cocaine supply. The cartel was moving up to 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every single day. That's 15 tons every day. The weekly revenue from this operation reached an estimated $420 million. To manage this money, Escobar employed 10 full-time accountants whose only job was to track, count, and allocate the incoming cash. He reportedly spent $2,500 every single month on rubber bands alone, simply because he needed them to bundle the bills. The rubber band budget alone was higher than what most families in Medellin earned in a year. And here's the detail that stops people cold every single time. Escobar's organization lost an estimated $2.1 billion per year. Not to law enforcement, not to rivals, but to rats and moisture. The cash was stored in warehouses, buried in walls and fields, hidden in garages and safe houses. There was simply so much of it that a significant portion rotted and was consumed before anyone could get to it. $2 billion in a year, gone. And it didn't matter because more was always coming in. When he was on the run and hiding in the mountains with his family in the early 1990s, his daughter daughter was cold one night, and he reportedly burned $2 million in cash to keep her warm. Not as a flex, not as a statement, but because the cash was there and his daughter was shivering. That's the scale of wealth we're talking about. At one point, Escobar made a formal offer to the Colombian government. He offered to personally pay off the country's entire national debt, which at the time stood around $10 billion, in exchange for a guarantee that he would never be extradited to the United States. The Colombian government declined, but the fact that the offer was on the table tells you everything about the position he occupied. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a financial force of nature who was negotiating with nation-states like he was their equal, because by that point, in many ways, he was. Now, here's where the story gets complicated, because Pablo Escobar was not simply a monster in a suit. The reason his legend has outlasted every other criminal of his era, the reason people in Medellin still lay flowers at his grave, the reason his face still appears on t-shirts sold around the world, is because Escobar understood something about power that most criminals never figure out. He understood that loyalty cannot be bought with fear alone. You need love too, or at least the appearance of it. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, Escobar poured enormous sums of money into Medellin's poorest communities. He built housing projects in neighborhoods where families were living in makeshift shelters. He constructed schools, hospitals, and churches. He installed soccer fields in barrios where children had nowhere to play. He handed out cash to the poor directly and personally, showing up in neighborhoods that the government had long since abandoned and positioning himself as the man who actually cared. One neighborhood he built in the western part of Medellin was called Barrio Pablo Escobar by its residents, and it still carries that same name today. For the people who lived there, this wasn't an abstraction. This was real, and their children had schools because of Pablo Escobar. Their sick relatives had clinics because of Pablo Escobar. The Colombian state had done nothing, and Pablo Escobar had done something. The loyalty that this created was profound and practical, because the poor communities of Medellin became a human shield for Escobar. They would not give him up. They could not be bribed to betray him, because in their experience, he had already given them more than any authority figure ever had. This philanthropy was strategic, without question, but that doesn't mean that it was entirely cynical. By most accounts, Escobar genuinely identified with the poor, came from poverty himself, and the resentment he felt toward the Colombian elite and the political establishment was real. In 1982, he was elected to Colombia's Congress as an alternate member of the Chamber of Representatives, running on a populist platform and presenting himself as a voice for the ordinary Colombian. He arrived in Congress with a driver and security detail, looking every inch of the man of the people he claimed to be. And yet, the same man who funded those schools and hospitals was simultaneously ordering the murders of journalists, judges, politicians, and police officers. The contradiction is not a small one. It sits at the heart of the Escobar legend, and it's why he became a myth rather than just a criminal. Monsters are simple. Pablo Escobar was not simple. Two words define Pablo Escobar's relationship with the Colombian state: plata o plomo. In Spanish, plata means silver, plomo means lead. In Escobar's world, that translated to one of the starkest choices a person could face: take the bribe or take the bullet. There was no third option. By 1982, when Escobar entered Congress, he seemed, at least from the outside, to be normalizing. He had money, he had power, he had a political platform, but the tensions between the cartel and the Colombian state were always there, simmering beneath the surface. Then everything changed in 1984. Colombia's Justice Minister, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, began pushing aggressively for the extradition of Colombian nationals to the United States to face drug charges. Extradition was Escobar's greatest fear. He could manage Colombian courts and Colombian police. The American legal system was a different matter entirely. Escobar had Lara Bonilla assassinated in April 1984. The Justice Minister was shot and killed while riding his car in Bogota. It was a direct declaration of war on the Colombian state, and the state responded by cracking down hard, forcing Escobar to flee temporarily to Panama. But Escobar did not respond to pressure by retreating. He escalated. In November 1985, the M19 guerrilla group, believed to have received financing from Escobar, stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogota and took the building hostage. The siege lasted 28 hours. When it was over, 98 people were dead, including 11 Supreme Court justices. And in the chaos and the fire that consumed the building, the extradition files that contained evidence against Escobar and his associates were conveniently destroyed. The terror continued into the late 1980s in ways that are almost impossible to fully absorb. In November 1989, a bomb planted on board Avianca Flight 203 detonated shortly after the plane took off from Bogota. All 107 passengers and 3 people on the ground were killed. The intended target was presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, who had missed the flight. Gaviria survived. 110 people who had nothing to do with Pablo Escobar did not. 9 days after the Avianca bombing, a truck bomb detonated outside the headquarters of Colombia's secret police, the DOS building in Bogota. More than 50 people were killed, killed and over 2,200 were injured in a single explosion. By the end of his campaign of terror, Escobar's organization had killed an estimated 600 police officers, 3 presidential candidates, an attorney general, and scores of judges and magistrates. He did not bend Colombia to his will through economics alone. He did it through industrialized violence on a scale that a sitting government struggled to contain. By 1991, the pressure had become intense enough that Pablo Escobar made a decision that seemed on the surface like a surrender. He announced he would turn himself in to Colombian authorities. The country exhaled. The United States is prepared to celebrate, and then the details of the surrender emerged. The world realized that Pablo Escobar had not surrendered at all. He had simply renegotiated his terms. The deal Escobar struck with the Colombian government included a prohibition on extradition to the United States and permission for him to design and build his own prison facility. The result was a compound in the mountains above Medellin that the press came to call La Catedral, which simply means the cathedral. From the outside, it looked like a prison, but on the inside, it was a luxury estate. La Catedral had a football pitch, a jacuzzi, a sauna, a fully equipped nightclub, a waterfall, large-screen televisions, fax machines, computers, and full-size dollhouse that Escobar had built for his daughter's visits. The guards were personally loyal to Escobar. Colombian police were prohibited from coming within 12 miles of the facility. He ran the Medellin cartel from inside La Catedral. Business continued. Orders were given. Money flowed. People were killed even while he was sequestered. The man was technically incarcerated, but in practice, he had simply relocated his office to a mountaintop resort with excellent views. It lasted about a year when the Colombian government, embarrassed by the international mockery and under enormous pressure from the United States, attempted to transfer Escobar to a genuine prison facility in July 1992. Escobar simply walked out. He escaped into the mountains and the cities, beginning what would become a 16-month manhunt that mobilized Colombian Special Forces, the DEA, elements of the United States Delta Force, Navy SEALs, and a vigilante group called Los Pepes, which was funded by rival cartel figures who wanted Escobar dead almost as badly as the government did. During this period, Escobar made radio broadcasts, sent communiques to the press, and conducted a public negotiation with an entire nation from hiding. He was being hunted by the combined resources of 2 governments and several criminal organizations, and he still found time to be theatrical about it. Then on December 2nd, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, Colombian security forces traced a radio call Escobar had made to his family and located him in a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. There was a brief firefight, and Pablo Escobar was shot and killed on the rooftop of a residential building. A single bullet, believed by many to have entered through his ear, ended the most consequential criminal career in modern history. His men carried his body down from the roof. A photograph was taken of Colombian police officers surrounding him, grinning and holding his head up for the camera, and the world tried to figure out what had just happened and what it meant now that he was gone. And now we get to the question the whole story has been building toward. Because the obvious question, after you've taken in everything Pablo Escobar was and everything he did, is this: why hasn't anyone done it again? The cocaine market didn't disappear when Escobar died. The demand didn't go anywhere. The poverty and inequality that created him in the first place didn't vanish overnight. So why is there no new Pablo Escobar today? The answer is not simply that law enforcement got better, though it did. The answer is structural. The conditions that made Escobar possible were specific to a particular time and a particular place, and those conditions have now fundamentally changed. When Escobar entered the cocaine trade in the early 1970s, the market was almost entirely uncharted territory. American demand was exploding, and the supply chains were crude and disorganized. Colombia's state institutions were weak, corrupt, and underfunded. The regulatory and intelligence sharing frameworks that now link law enforcement agencies across dozens of countries simply did not exist. Escobar walked through a door that was standing wide open. When Escobar died and the Medellin cartel collapsed, the drug trade did not disappear. It became fragmented. It became decentralized by design, and that design was a direct lesson drawn from Escobar's downfall. The great vulnerability of the Medellin cartel was its centralization, its dependence on one man. Kill that one man, and the whole structure comes down. Every major trafficking organization that followed internalized this lesson and organized itself accordingly. Look at El Chapo Guzman and the Sinaloa cartel. El Chapo operated in deliberate, disciplined obscurity. There were no Forbes lists for El Chapo. There was no congressional seat, no public persona. The whole model was anonymity and compartmentalization, and it worked for decades precisely because it was the opposite of everything Escobar had done. The criminology think tank Insight Crime, which tracks organized crime across Latin America, has noted that a modern counterpart to Escobar is generally hard to come by because there's no single figure capable of exercising the kind of centralized control he had, not even in Medellin itself, let alone across the international trade. The model that Escobar built was a product of its time, and the world world has restructured itself specifically to prevent it from happening again. Pablo Escobar has been dead since 1993, and yet his cultural footprint keeps expanding. This is perhaps the strangest part of the entire story. When Netflix released Narcos in 2015, a generation of viewers who had only the vaguest awareness of who Escobar was were suddenly consumed by him. The result was a measurable surge in narco-tourism to Medellin. Tours dedicated to Escobar have been operating there since at least 2007 and continue today, taking visitors to his grave, to La Catedral, to the rooftop in the Los Olivos neighborhood where he was killed, and to Hacienda Napoles, his former private estate that has since been converted into a theme park. Escobar's son, Sebastian Marroquin, who changed his name after his father's death, has sold clothing branded with his father's mugshot internationally. In 2024, the Colombian parliament began debating legislation to ban Pablo Escobar merchandise outright, which tells you everything about how much of it is still moving 3 decades after his death. And then there are the hippos. Escobar imported 4 hippos from Africa to his private zoo at Hacienda Napoles. After his death, they were left behind, and they've since bred in Colombia's rivers and wetlands. The population is now estimated at over 100 animals. It is considered a serious invasive ecological problem. His influence extends, improbably, even to the animal kingdom. So what do we do with Pablo Escobar? He was a murderer who ordered the deaths of police officers, politicians, journalists, and civilians. There's no romanticizing that. The violence was real, and Colombia spent decades dealing with the consequences. But Escobar was also a product of a specific set of conditions that converged in one place at one time. A weakened state and an exploding and unregulated market. A man with a particular combination of charisma, intelligence, and ruthlessness needed to exploit both. Remove any one of those elements and the story changes. Change the timing by a decade in either direction, and the story doesn't happen at all. The reason there will never be another kingpin like Pablo Escobar is not simply a matter of better law enforcement or surveillance technology, though those things are real factors. The deeper reason is that the world closed the door he walked through. Modern criminal organizations are built specifically to avoid producing another Escobar because his story taught them very conclusively that the man at the top of the pyramid is the first one to fall. The world had seen what happens when hunger, intelligence, and ruthlessness come together without anything to contain them, and it made sure it would never have to find out again.